imagine that you're creating content in 1970s or 1950s or 1960s or anything which is before the digital age basically. Now, there are two different scenes that you're shooting. The first scene is probably of an entire area of a green park, and the second scene is probably an inside of a building. Now, between these two scenes, there is some sort of continuity of story that has happened. Once you've done shooting this, and by the way, you're shooting all of this on reels, right? Not the Instagram kind. I'm talking about the reel on which images would get captured because of the light and everything else. Now, if you're creating a content which is based on reels and you need to put these two scenes together as a final movie, how do you think you would be able to do this? I would probably assume that you would take in the reel from the first scene and the second scene, and then you'll probably place it together. That's probably how you place scenes together, or how you transition scenes from one to another. Transition, speaking grammatically, is basically just movement from one to another. Could be a scene in this case for which we are going to be talking about. There are a lot of videos already on YouTube and the internet that explains how you can create different transitions. But I don't want to create a run-of-the-mill video where you're learning something that you can learn in 500 different million ways, right? I want to explain you why these transitions are important and what are the most important factors when you're thinking of these transitions. Of course, I'm assuming that you have only just started learning video editing, or you have been learning video editing for a while and have never wondered what sort of transitions to use, or you've just gone ahead and used the most basic ones which are available in Premiere Pro or After Effects for that matter. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about what transitions are supposed to do, what they mean, and why are they important that I have to create a video about it for you guys. So let's get started. Going back to the example that I started talking about, there are two different parts of reels that you've recorded and you want to place them together one after the other. Now, the most basic idea of how you can place them together is the one gets cut and the next one starts playing from there. That is the most simple transition which is available to you, to any other editor who is probably working on filmmaking. This one is called a cut. A cut is basically the first clip stops and the second clip starts. As simple as that. Think of it always in terms of how you probably would have done it if you were a director working in 1950s or 1970s and was placing these reels together, right? That's basically how you can play around with a lot of different transitions. Now, slightly differently. Let's say the first scene that you had for the park, you've recorded a slightly longer duration of this, about 3 to 4 seconds. And similarly, before the action starts in the flat or the house scene, the other scene that we were talking about, you have also recorded another 7 to 8 seconds of content. Just plain slide which has the image or the video of the location that we're talking about. Now, instead of placing them one after the other, place them on top of each other and give it slightly longer time to convey from or transition from one to another. Now this one is called dissolve, right? When you're transitioning from slight different radiations, and when you're working on this dissolve, what you can also do, take it one step further, is have the previous reel have a lot of light coming through it. So basically, in the starting there is a lot of light coming through it, which is making it very clear, and then slowly the light can dissolve or the light can reduce in visibility, and it can go the other way around for the second scene. That is, initially the light that's passing through that reel is slightly low and then keeps on increasing until you can see this in full brightness. This is called a dissolve transition. What we just did with adding the light is basically giving it some sort of a transition which is not very hard and fast, it's not very jerky. There is some time for it to for the audience to accept the new scene before the previous one gets over. In both of these cases where you had the first one as a cut and the second one as a dissolve, there was one slight difference apart from, of course, placing the reels together. That factor was time. Time is a very important factor when you're thinking of transition. Think of it this way, as the amount of time that you have from moving from one to another, there is a lot of available time for the audience to imbibe what's happening or to understand what's happening. When you place it in a lot of, in very less time, there is very less that somebody can probably go back and think of when the transition is happening. So that's why time plays a huge part when you're designing or deciding a transition, right? If you'd want to move from a lot of different transitions, a lot of different scenes one after the other, you do not have a lot of time. In those cases, you can just go with a very simple cut. Slightly differently, if you have slightly longer scenes and you'd want to give time, or you want to show the passage of time, you can take a slightly longer transition, slightly extended in duration. Picture this. You have a scene of a clock on a wall. You want to show passage of time. You want to show that maybe a couple of hours have passed, or there's a lot of time that has passed between the first and the second shot. What can you do? Instead of just placing it or showing it as a cut from the first into the second one, you could play it slightly as a dissolved transition. That showcases a passage of time with that clock as well. Now, let's say if you'd want to get slightly more creative, there are slightly different methods of doing that as well. There have been various ways in which a lot of directors have been creative in transitioning from one reel to another. Think of the lens cover that is there, right? You'd want to show that probably one part of the entire scene is in focus when you're closing from one scene and then before you move on to the next one. I can think of a very simple scene where there is somebody who has a ring in his hand, and the director wants the focus for that ring before the scene ends. So you can do a sort of a iris in or a zoomed in transition where the focus finally goes at the ring, and then that's where the scene cuts into the next one. This is called an iris in transition, and these are basically just a simple method that directors had been creative when playing with the lens cover of the cameras itself. Now, this is a very simple way, but all of these have been replicated in a very similar fashion in the digital world as well. Let me do this. Let me showcase you about 4 different ways of transitions. You've already probably understood the first 2, which is the cut and the dissolve. The third one is like a fade or like a dip to black sort of scene where you're reducing the amount of light which is available on the seats, and maybe you can get back directly from there. And the fourth one that we're going to be talking about is this creative transition, which is when you're changing or you're using the lens cover itself, maybe in the old times, but now we can use it slightly digitally, and we can see how that can happen. So let's see how these transitions play out in the digital world. Moving on, next we have fades or dips. People call it fades because it used to fade the film, and they also call it dip to black or dip to white in either of these cases. The one that I've chosen over here is a dip to black. So over here, that is exactly what happens. In the middle or the center part between both of these clips, the frame or the canvas becomes entirely black, and then it goes back from black to the color itself, to whatever the footage is. Right, and that's exactly what dip to black is. Very similar. You can of course set the duration over here as well, and be very similar to the previous one. You can set the duration over here as well. Now moving on, this one was dip to black. Let's see a dip to white, which looks something like this. Let me play this, and that is how the dip to white looks like. Very similar to dip to black, but the effect is slightly different. So a black could just be a passage of time where there is not a lot to think about, but white could represent cleanliness, purity, serenity, or something of those lines. Right? So if you're ending a scene which is supposed to be ending on a very serendipitous note, maybe you can keep a dip to white over there. Now moving on, the next one are the wipes. I already talked about you when I was explaining the camera covers. Now these camera cover transitions can be manipulated very, very thematically in the digital world. So you can do multiple types of wipe over here. The first one that I have is called a split, which is the footage splits and starts revealing the one behind or the next one basically. So that is the split transition. That could be an inset. So you can choose that it looks like an inset earlier and then it moves into a full set into the full frame. Then you can have a very simple wipe which just transitions from one side to the other one. It's like a car wiper, it just ends up wiping the entire canvas. And then you can also have an iris. Now this is the iris that I was talking about earlier, if you remember. So instead of probably closing it on this or maybe transitioning it between two different footages, I could also use it to transition out of a frame as well. Here are last two bits that I would want to talk to you about. We've already seen how transitions can be applied. Here are some elements that you can play around in these transitions in Premiere Pro. So again, the first thing that I would do is go to the effects panel so that I can have this open, and the second thing is going to be using effect controls. Now once I have these controls, maybe I can play around with this. I'll just keep this over here and let's use these transitions slightly differently now. We've already seen all of these. The first thing that I want to do is show how you can put a transition towards the end as well, apart from middle of the two footages. So maybe we can have a simple dip to black. So let's say it becomes, hold it and drag it towards the end of a footage as well, where it just transitions from the original footage into a final black visual. That is dip to black. So you can put it even at the end. So it's a transition to the end of a video clip. Similarly, you can do for any other things, but you can also start it instead of having it there. Let's delete this one. And you can also have it started from a different transition. So there we have. So instead of starting from, so what we have over here is a dip to white, where it starts from a black color, it goes to white, and then it goes to a red color. So that is how a dip to white can work out. Now the last thing that I want you to understand is when you put across a transition over here, certain transitions, they have various effects that can also be manipulated. So if I just click on the transition, make sure that this one is highlighted, I can go into effect controls and let's give it slightly more space over here. Now we can see how these transitions can be played out. Of course, there are a few elements of duration, alignment, which is start at cut, basically starts at the cut, it ends at the cut, or it can be in the middle of the cut itself. These are the two different variations of how the transitions would look like. So this is about 100% and this is the 0% of the transition. And this is how you can see it when you start or end it. You can also see actual resources so that you can see what your footage is going to look like. You could choose somewhat of a border width in this particular case. You can see that this one gives a slightly black border when I have chosen this. Maybe I can even give it a slightly different color, let's say a green border over here, and that's what comes over here. So you'd see something like this. There are a couple of other variations over here as well. Let's set it back to the usual things. Here's one other thing that I would want you to see, that you can see that these small arrows are over here. Now these small arrows or triangles are basically the direction of the wipe in this particular case. So wipe could go something like this. So it starts off from where, and from the location that we had selected, it starts off from there, which is from the southeast or southeast to northeast, which is bottom right to top left. So that's how it goes. You can also change it and see maybe if you're doing it from north to south or from top to bottom, this is how it can act. Now go ahead, try out a lot of these different variations in honor of the transition that we've just seen and see whatever works for you. Now let's get back to me talking all the way with you. Well then, I think you've understood these 4 different types of transitions. As I said, I am only here to explain you what these transitions are and how they were related in the original times when the movie making had been started. Today, if you are a motion graphics designer, you might have a slightly different way of playing around with these transitions as well, because digitally there are way more many options which are available than what a director would have had earlier. On that note, I would be creating a couple of more videos on how you can use these effective transitions and how you can be creative around it. The one that interests me the most is the match cut. You would have seen a lot of those on TikToks or Instagram Reels as well. We'll see how you can create all of these in the upcoming sets of videos. So be back here in about a week or so that we can discuss these transitions in detail. And in the meantime, if you think there's one thing that you really want to understand, put those in the comments below. We will go through that and we'll create some very specific content which is directed only towards you. Well then, hit the like, share and subscribe, and I will see you next time.